Adams State College. Great stories begin here.
Before we start today, I'd like to remind everyone that we do have one more lunchtime talk. Is it Thursday of next week? Yep. Thursday of next week, Dr. Weathers is going to be giving a talk on chaos and practice. Get that right? Close enough? Okay. Well, welcome everybody to today's lunchtime talk. I've had the pleasure twice before of introducing Dr. Camley, and I'm pretty sure he's probably hoping about now I'm not going to embarrass him again.
Right, yeah.
But honestly, I can't help it. And this is the reason. It's simply because I think so highly of him. In my mind, Bob Camley is the model of what a college professor should do. He was my teacher for 2 classes, worked on my master's degree. He was my advisor for my master's degree for the research that we did. He has won every award, every teaching award UCCS offers. He has won all the research awards they offer. He was the first person to explain the theory behind giant magnetoresistance, which is the phenomenon that allows manufacturers to build those little portable disk drives that have 500 gigabytes or a terabyte even on them. He was the one who explained the theory. He does all this great teaching, great research, along with the rest of a well-balanced life. He's a father and a husband, he's a musician. He's just an all-around, great guy. And I think very highly of him. Hopefully in the next hour you'll begin to understand why I think so highly of Bob. At this point I'll stop embarrassing him, and you can join me in welcoming our speaker, Dr. Bob Camley.
Well, thank you very much for having me back another time. I've enjoyed the previous couple of visits, and you're right, I wish you would stop that. Because it always sets the expectations so high, and you can never match those. Okay, so I think every time I've come here I've started out with, I'm not really an expert on this topic. And I'm not really an expert on this one either. I got into this by accident about 5 years ago when I was just asked to give a talk on it, and I put something together. So in fact what I'm going to do is the talk from 5 years ago, and then what I want to do is show you how things have changed actually quite dramatically in the last 5 years. So is the U.S. still competitive in technology is the question. There is a one-word answer to it in 2005. Yes. You're pretty much free to go at this point. In 2005, it was competitive, but there were already some troubling signs with, if you look at number of patents per country, number of papers per country. If you looked at higher education from country to country, there's some troubling signs even in 2005. I want to talk a lot about our dependence and our benefit in the United States on foreign scientists. In fact, you'll see that I would say most of the scientists in the U.S., working in the U.S., are not born in the U.S. Why is there a problem even in 2005? The answer is, many of you will know, there's no money in going into higher education. And then I want to talk a little bit about, can the U.S. remain some kind of destination country, which is really where we've been for the last 40 years. So let's talk about the yes at the moment, 2005. If you look at the number, basically all the industrialized developed countries, and you look at who was doing the most spending on research and development, this is from about the year 2000. The U.S. was spending 40% of all the monies being spent on R&D, the U.S. was spending. That's really pretty good. European Union was spending about 30%, Japan about 20%. So we were, at the time, quite actively pursuing research and development. And if you look historically at the monies with, this is a graph. I don't know if you can see this one, but the U.S. is the solid line here. Europe basically is the dotted line. Japan is here. This is money spent on R&D, and you can see everybody is increasing more or less at the same rate. So these kinds of numbers, 40, 30, 20, had really held true for 20 years. Okay, if you looked at the balance of trade in intellectual property with the U.S. and the rest of the world, we had a $23 billion surplus around the year 2000. So that was good. It was our only surplus. right? I mean, everything else, we had a negative balance of trade, but intellectual properties and technological products, we were at 23 billion surplus. That's not so bad. If you looked a little harder, there's some troubling signs. If you look at number of patents issued as a function of year, from 2000 to 2004, what you see is the US is kind of staying steady or going down maybe a little, but the rest of people from other countries, their contribution is clearly getting quite a bit larger. If I remember correctly, these are patents issued in the US, and already residents of other countries are starting to be quite a fraction of the patents issued in the United States. So patents are getting to be a problem. If you look at number of articles, who publishes articles? Again, this is time from 1988 up to about 2000. And the US is this black line. We're pretty much constant. So that's 200,000 articles a year. Western Europe used to be below us and since has come up. And Japan, China, all the others are down here a little bit. Again, we clearly in the United States are doing the vast majority of research in terms of publications for a single country. There's no doubt about it. So in the year 2005, were we competitive? Yeah, not only were we competitive, we were basically dominating. You're going to see things are going to change, and I'll show you the new version of this graph in a little bit. The one thing that really was disturbing in some sense in 2005 is enrollments. And I take as an example the graduate enrollments in physics as a function of years, starting in 1965 and going to 2002. The red line are US citizens, the yellow line here are foreign, and what you can see is back in 1970, maybe 70–80% of the people who were doing a PhD degree in physics were from the United States, and maybe 20% were from another country. We've completely inverted that. About this point, half and half, meaning half of the people who do PhDs in the United States are from another country. There are many, many good things about that, but there's some troubling things as well. If you go a little farther and look at postdocs, these are basically researchers primarily paid by grants from the federal government, and you look at the number of people in these different fields. So the number of postdoc researchers in engineering, basically 70% of all researchers in engineering in the United States, postdoc level, which is nearly everybody, are from other countries. In physics, it's 67%. In computer science, 62. In life sciences, 55. In social science, 31. In psychology, it's 26. Now, what I'm going to argue is that there's a tremendous benefit from having people from other countries, and we have to hope they'll still continue to come. Because if 70% of your workforce, so almost 70% of the research workforce in engineering is from another country, if they decide to stop coming, we won't have any research workforce. That's the issue. Just to give you another feeling, a few years ago, the physics department in Colorado Springs did a faculty search, and of the applicants, 96% were foreign born. 96% of the applicants were foreign born. Here's a distribution in terms of percentages, I think. 19 from India, 19 from China, 13 from Russia, 5 from Ukraine, 5 from Romania, Germany, Korea, US, 4. That's it. Only 4% of the applicants. We hired somebody from the Ukraine, actually. What's interesting about this is basically the only European country you still see applying. Germany and Belgium, we had no applicants from France, we had no applicants from England. Apparently, most of Europe doesn't think it's worth coming to the United States anymore to get a job. And this comes to this issue about the U.S. having benefited from foreign scientists. So here's the former chief scientist at AT&T Labs, and he said, in mathematics, something on the order of 57% of the PhD grads are foreign nationals in the U.S. From our perspective, the fact that we have these talented foreign nationals makes a tremendous difference. If we hadn't had them, I don't know we would be where we are today, and I think that's just simply absolutely true. And the worry for the U.S. is not that these people are here, the worry is that we won't continue to get them. Okay. The U.S. has benefited from any number of foreign scientists. I just collected up, for fun, some of the recent Nobel Prize winners and in the U.S. who originated in other countries. And you see, almost every year, we had some Nobel Prize winner that came from another country. It's interesting to notice Germany, UK, Canada, Germany, UK. That's great. The trouble is, these are people who immigrated to the United States 30 years ago. If we don't continue to get foreign scientists, will we still have Nobel Prize winners? Will we still have cutting-edge research in the United States? So I want to talk a little bit about why there's a problem. The problem is not that we're having foreign scientists. Perfect, great. The problem is we're not growing our appropriate share of homegrown scientists. Why is it that that happens? And I'm going to argue primarily it doesn't pay off to the individual to go into a research science. And secondly, that our culture as a whole doesn't value science the way some other cultures do and doesn't push it. So let me show why it doesn't pay off. At least it doesn't pay off to get an advanced degree and go into research. Here's the argument. In physics, if we have a bachelor's degree student, that student will go out and get a job for $55,000 a year. It's a nice salary, actually. And if you imagine that there is no inflation, they never get a raise, nothing good ever happens to this person. Let's imagine that it's just static. That person makes $55,000 or so for the next 10 years. If instead of going into industry, they decide to go for a PhD, here's what happens. They'll spend 6 years making $15,000 instead of $55,000. 6 years, making really a small fraction of what they could make. Then, if they're lucky, they'll spend another 2-3 years making $30-some thousand. And then, if they're lucky, they'll get hired at a faculty position, and they'll make what they could have made 10 years earlier. It's a frightening prospect when you look at it, especially because out of this they may also be paying tuition. And you know, 10 years is a long time to go enter into a long training program which doesn't actually benefit you in terms of salary. Now look, there are many, many benefits about being in the academic world and doing research and teaching. I love it all. So I'm not going to argue that it's worthless to go ahead and get a PhD. You have a different kind of life and a different lifestyle, and if you like research, if you like teaching, this is the way to go. But financially, it really doesn't pay off to get much more than a bachelor's degree. If you add up all the missing salary in this period, it's a minimum of $300,000 over 10 years that you've lost. What could you do with $300,000? Buy a nice house, right? So 10 years, you could have bought a house with a difference, just the difference in earnings over 10 years. Actually, it's probably higher than $300,000. Why? This person is not going to get no raises and so on in industry for 10 years. It's simply not going to happen. Probably industry will get better raises than PhD students or postdocs. So I would guess it's probably closer to $400,000, maybe $500,000. $500,000. That's quite an investment for the individual. So it doesn't pay off to the individual is one reason why I think we're not producing our own scientists, or our own scientists in the appropriate numbers. The second issue is the U.S. as a culture doesn't value science in the same way as some other cultures. It's not pushed. There's a nice little story from this guy who was the CEO of Intel, and I know you can all read, but I'm going to read it to you anyway. He went to China, and he noted the following. He went for the International Science Fair. He says, the science fair in the United States attracts some 50,000 American high school kids. It's actually great. I mean, it really is exciting. The best ones get to go to the International Science Fair. In the US, 50,000 kids participate every year. This guy was in China 10 days ago. He said, how many kids in China do science fairs? And the answer was 6 million. Now, okay, you all know China is bigger than the United States, right? So there has to be a difference. Let's kind of figure it out. The US has about 300 million people. China has 1.2 billion people. So it's a factor of 4 in population. So if I take the American number, 50,000, and I multiply by 4, it's 200,000? So comparatively, if we had the population of China, 200,000 American kids would be in it, but they have 6 million. See a difference? The point is that the kids in American classes in the US are not much really being pushed in science compared to China. By factors of 10, these are the numbers of kids who are involved. If you look at the percentage as another statistic, look at the 24-year-old population and see who has a science degree. Any kind of science degree. Math, physics, chemistry, engineering, biology. And you look at the percentage of the 24-year-olds who have a science degree. In 1975, Japan led the world. 4.6%. Not really very high. The US was number 3 in the world with 4%. Then Germany, Canada, UK, Taiwan, South Korea. Actually, the whole world has recognized, in some sense, that they have to have more science degrees than this. And so the whole world, if you look at the year 2000, has increased the percentage. Finland went from 4% to 13%. France went from not on the list to 11%. Taiwan, South Korea, UK, Sweden, Ireland, Spain, Japan, Netherlands, Canada, all in the 8 to 10%. And the US, we went from 4% up to 5.8%. What does this tell you? It basically tells you all of these countries have recognized the value of doing science and are actually pushing to do it, whereas the US made really a relatively small increase in the number of scientists. This is why we don't have any homegrown scientists in the United States. There isn't the culture and the backing of the government to develop the scientists, the number of scientists. Okay, if you look at our government, this is going back to the culture where the government spends on what they think is valuable, and they spend about $5 billion per year on basic research in physical sciences and engineering. This number has been $5 billion a year for 30 years. For 30 years, that number basically hasn't changed. The last couple of years, it's gotten a little better. Adjusted for inflation, it turns out it's a 37% decrease in spending on physical sciences. While all the other countries in the world are having this large increase, we are, in fact, having a large decrease over the last 30 years. It's really quite substantial. So, look, the real truth of the matter is, for many, many years, the US, as I said, has benefited from having many, many foreign scientists. And I hope we continue to. And the reason they're going to come now is not because their own countries don't have good science. The reason they're going to come now, according to this guy, Matt Loff at UC Davis, he says, it's not the fact that the US education is better, but it's that they would lead to a green card and a chance to stay in the United States permanently, where living is easier. That's why people are coming to the US now. Someday, many of those things are going to change. Foreign countries now are having a higher standard of living. They're having better science. They're having their own better or good universities. A lot of these foreign scientists are no longer going to come to the United States. And this is going to be, I think, a severe problem for us in the next 10 years. Whoops. So, that was the 2005 version. And now I want to talk about why I think it is going to be a severe problem. Is the U.S. still competitive? Yes, we're still competitive. Is the U.S. still leading? No. It's simple. No. Before we had all these disturbing signs, if we looked at papers, balance of trade, education, R&D investment, every single one of these has gotten worse. There isn't one that looks better. And some of them have gotten completely worse. And as an example of a disaster, I want to point to what's happened to the semiconductor industry in the last 20 years. And at the very end, because I don't want you to go away all completely depressed, I'm going to have, you know, I know everybody's getting silent going, oh, gloom and doom. When I wrote this topic to Robert, he wrote back, sounds interesting in sort of a disaster sort of way. Or okay, so I have to have something briefly hopeful, but that'll only take 2-3 minutes. Okay, let's look at the even more disturbing signs and see what we have. Remember when we talked about number of papers produced every year, and we only went to about here. Look at what happened since then. The US, first of all, has continued to fall behind Europe. We didn't make it back up. That wasn't just a fluctuation. China has started to increase dramatically, and Asia as a whole, you see, is now basically competitive with the US and Europe. So there are three, if you like, centers of science and technology research, the US, Europe, and Asia, all about the same. Some of this is inevitable. You can't be at the top forever when the rest of the world is starting coming up, but we're not even increasing anymore. If you look not just at science and engineering articles, but just more specialized at engineering articles, the things look even worse. This is saying, okay, we're losing our dominance. I want to show you just engineering articles. Here at the bottom is the US. Here, almost twice as high is Europe, and almost, again, another factor, well, not quite, but almost the same distance, is Asia. And by the way, I'm not just making these numbers up. They come from the science and engineering indicators from the National Science Foundation. What you see is the following. The US is basically flat, oh, maybe a slight increase. Asia has a huge increase, and the European group is certainly increasing much more than the United States. So what's going to happen if you extend those trends just a little bit farther? You're going to see we're way off the map, and we will not be competitive. We currently are still in the ball game here. Just go another 10 years, and you'll see that we will not be competitive, which I think is quite a scary factor. It's not even we won't be on top. We won't be competitive. If you look, remember balance of trade? Remember we had a surplus up to about the year 2000? Yeah, well, after the year 2000, we no longer have a surplus. This is balance of trade in high-tech products. We do not sell to the rest of the world, they sell to us. And it's not, you know, maybe it'll turn around, but I didn't get any data past 2002. Pretty scary. Remember, percentage of spending? I showed you these numbers, 40, 30, 20. Total percentage of spending through all R&D. The US in 2000 or so spent 40%. I showed you this nice graph that said we're all increasing about the same rate. That changed. Remember these numbers. There's going to be a test on the next slide. Just 40, 30, 20. So the next slide shows what happened since the year 2000 or so. Here was the US percentage, 40. So what color is this? Mauve? And what color is this?
Reddish.
Okay, the mauve is the old one, and the reddish is the current status. You see, the old one, we really were at 40%, and we have dropped down to about 36, 37%. Europe dropped slightly from the mauve to the reddish, but not as much. And Asia came up substantially from, what, 25 to 30. Now, some of this is natural. Asia was underdeveloped, China, India, Singapore, South Korea. Some of it is natural. The point is, if this increases, this is just over 10 years. If this kind of thing continues, they're going to continue to increase, we're going to continue to decrease, we could be out of the running. And I'm going to argue in some fields we are already out of the running. This one is a disturbing factor for me. I argued in the 2005 version, I said, we're a destination country. People from other countries want to come here because we have good education, because we have a good standard of living, we have the ability to do science and research, and people are interested in doing that. If you look at Chinese students and where they went for their higher education, this was for PhDs, from 1987 to 1999, well, to about 1993, first of all, the number of Chinese students is increasing with time. This is perfectly sensible. China had been a completely undeveloped country, was trying very hard to industrialize and become a modern country. And so, of course, they're going to send a larger and larger number of people through the PhD system. And from 1987 to about 1993 or so, half of them went to US universities and half of them went to Chinese universities. But around 1993 or so, an increasing number go to the Chinese universities. So we are no longer, in a sense, a destination for the Chinese students as a whole. It's even coming down. It's not even just increasing slower. It's coming down, the number of Chinese students who come to the United States. And now 75% stay in China and about 20-some% come to the US. That's all. Okay, that's China. Turns out it's true for nearly all the Asian countries. Here is the same picture for South Korea, except it happened a little bit earlier, 1989. Up to 1989, about 50-50. After that, they stopped coming to the United States and they stayed home preferentially. Here is Taiwan. I don't get the Taiwan one. But you can see that ultimately the trend is the same. There are starting to be more and more students staying in Taiwan. The number of students coming to the US peaked and is clearly dropping off. We are no longer a destination, the way we were, for students from Asia. We are starting, as you can see, the number of students from Asia coming here is dropping and has been for already a decade or longer. So what's going on in the US with US students in graduate programs, in higher education? What's happening there? If you look, again, I'm in physics, so I tell a lot of my examples are from physics. If you look at the year 2005, 2006, there were 500 master's degrees. Out of the 500 master's degrees, 75% of them went to make money. 25% went to higher education, to graduate school, to doing research. That makes perfect sense with what I showed you earlier, right? If you know that you're going to lose $500,000 if you go this route, most people are going to choose that route. It's pretty simple. So most of the students already in graduate programs leave. 75%. If you're from another country, for non-US citizens, the numbers are exactly reverse. 75% of them go to grad school and only 25% look for employment. Why? Typically they don't have a green card yet. They can't go look for employment. They're here on a student visa, which is great. But they all stay in grad school because it pays off for them economically. For American citizens, it pays off economically to go into employment and not get the PhD, not go on to teaching or research. I want to do the semiconductor industry as a special example. It was interesting because while I was searching around, I found this report from the General Accountability Office to congressional committees from 2006, and they said it all in the title. U.S. semiconductor and software industries increasingly produce in China and India. By the time it gets around to 2010, you could rephrase this. All software and semiconductor is done in Asia. Pretty much. I don't mean literally, but that's almost what you can say. Okay, you may remember, in fact, this whole semiconductor industry, making chips and integrated circuits and little watch circuits and everything else, that started in the U.S. around the 1970s, 1980s. It was a U.S. invention. It was really industrialized in the U.S. But in the 60s to 80s, basically they started moving assembly abroad. So you might make the chips and so on in the United States, but you'd assemble them into products in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Malaysia. 20 years that worked really well, and then they said, we don't need to do that. We don't need to ship the integrated circuits there. We can have them make those integrated circuits. It'll be cheaper. So from the 1980s to 2000, they shipped the so-called foundries for making integrated circuits, or fabrication plants, were shipped to Taiwan, Philippines, Malaysia, China. Okay, 20 years of that. There are basically very few fabs in the United States. Then we ship the design abroad to Taiwan, Philippines, Malaysia, China, Singapore, South Korea, and so on. Basically, we've shipped the entire industry. The only thing left, in principle, the only thing left is actual hardcore research. But think about it. If the manufacturing, all of it, the design, the manufacturing of the chips, and the putting it together, and then putting it into a device is all done in Asia, we're not going to do the research here. That's just not going to happen. And in fact, it's pretty much gone. So I'm going to do the next year for them. 2000 and beyond, basically all research is going to move to Asia. And I'll show you some proof of this in a minute. Asian firms will design and produce their own products. They're not going to be waiting for the US to produce stuff in designs. So, to give you a feeling how this worked, in 1975, the US had 75% of the semiconductor market. In 2000, we had moved from 75% to 24%. Almost nothing. And Japan had 32, South Korea 10, China just 2, Taiwan 12. Okay, we're still pretty big. In 2007, we had shrunk in the US from 24 to 17. Look at South Korea. It went from 10 to 18. South Korea has got a bigger share of the semiconductor market than the United States. And Taiwan has the same share of the Do you know how big Taiwan, anybody know how big Taiwan is? Okay, I don't either. But I know South Korea, it's around 40 million. I'm sure Taiwan is smaller. I mean, Taiwan maybe 20 million? Is that like a reasonable number? So with 20 million, now I'm just going to pretend it's true. 20 million people, we have 300 million people. So they're 10 times, at least 10 times smaller than they are and have the same market share as we do in the United States. Does this mean we're falling behind? I think the answer is yes. We are not competitive in semiconductors. Taiwan, South Korea, and China have about half of all semiconductors. Japan, if you add in Japan, it's 2/3. Asia really is dominating. Give you a specific example. In 2009, 16 fabs, semiconductor fabrication plants, were started throughout the world. One was in the US, just one. 6 were in China, 5 were in Taiwan. Now look, the US has been in this business for a while. We don't need to build as many new fabs as other countries. That's appropriate, but only one? That means there's only one that's going to take advantage of new technologies? It's not a big enough investment to stay competitive. We did lead in one thing, though. If you looked at the number that were closed, there were 27, and we led with 15. 15 fabs were closed in the US, 4 in Europe, 4 in Japan. This is, again, the fact that we closed the most is not too surprising. We have a lot of older fabs. The fact that we only started one and we closed 15 says you're sending everything abroad. Just to give you a feeling, these are estimates from the industry by what's going to happen in 2014, 2 years after the world comes to an end in 2012. They're looking at things that basically cover who's making what: automatic test equipment and packaging and assembly. And basically you see 80 to 85% of all of this equipment that's going to be sold is going to be sold into Asia. That's where 85% of all the work is going to be done, where 85% of all the research is going to be done. We are having some national security issues. If you want to put a semiconductor chip in a plane, you don't want every other country to see what's in that chip. Right? If you're going to put it in a jet fighter or a missile or whatever, we can't ship those to India or to Taiwan. We have to do it ourselves here, and that's actually getting to be somewhat difficult. This should have an effect on enrollment. And so actually I picked up some data from my university, Colorado Springs. Number of majors in electrical engineering over the last 10 years or so, 2000 to 2010. Well, you can all see what it did. It dropped by a factor of 2. So I claimed all of semiconductor work had been shipped off to Asia, and the number of majors, particularly majors who would do semiconductor work, declined by a factor of 2. If you look at computer science, this declined by a factor of 3 in the last 10 years. That's a huge decline. Okay, so this is a little bit microscopic. It's one place. So I found some other data. University of Maryland, College Park. It's a big university in Maryland. It's right near the Research Triangle area. It's right near the federal government's, here, let me give you money for doing research. Their number of engineering majors also dropped by a factor of 2 in the last 10 years. There are no engineering majors, electrical engineering, because there are no jobs. Why are there no jobs? Because they're all in Asia. If you look, this is the worst graph in the world. But what it shows is all the engineering majors as a function of year, and I'm going to highlight one for you. That one. I added a little more data on that went farther. That's the electrical engineering. And you can see nationally. You can see there were 120,000 electrical engineering enrollments, down to 60,000 over the past 15 or so years. Again, nationally, the number of engineers has decreased by 2. What have other countries been doing during this time? So here is a graph of who's producing students, bachelor's degrees in engineering. The big tall one that just goes up enormously is China. China should be going up. They're working on increasing the technological basis for their country and economy. Of course they're going to go up. The US is going completely flat. I put out the numbers here because I know you can't read these things. China puts out 350,000 degree students every year. The US in electrical engineering, 75,000. Japan, 100,000. South Korea, again, 75,000. Remember, South Korea is 10 times smaller than the US. They're producing the same number of engineers, but it's 10 times smaller. If you just add up all these numbers, here's the statistic. For every one US engineer, there are 7 in Asia. Every one engineer we produce here, there are 7 in Asia. Where do you think the center of mass of science and research is going to be? Not here. we are now, I would claim, not competitive in this particular field. I'm not even counting Europe, by the way. Just between us and Asia, 1 bachelor's degree in engineering here, 7 in Asia. Okay, finally, the good news. Don't worry, this won't take very long. There is actually a recognition of the problem. There was an NSF report which states the title very clearly, Globalization of Science and Engineering Research. And they say, here's their recommendation, we urge federal attention to sustain the U.S. world leadership in science and engineering in response to growing capacity around the world. And they finally get it really clearly. Our nation's future prosperity and security depends on a strong and unswavering federal commitment. Why does our prosperity depend on it? Think of what has actually governed our prosperity in the last 50 years. The semiconductor industry, the PCs, the software industry, those have driven our country's prosperity, right? They really have. The steel industry did not do it. Agriculture has been a mainstay, but is not driving any new substantial creation of wealth. It has been technology that has made us prosperous in the last 50 years, and we have now given or rented out most of that technology. And if we don't continue to have some technological advances, we're going to be in bad shape. They said it pretty clearly. Unfortunately, nobody's listening. We're still leading, I showed you a graph like this, we're still leading at the higher levels. This is for production of PhDs, not bachelor's degrees. The US is this red one, China is this blue one. We are still at the higher levels of research leading the world. That's good. There's some indication that there's some attention to better funding models. If you look at the HMI, the thing I wrote up there, Howard Hughes Medical Institute, they have a model that where you fund people for 5 years, they pick the people, not the projects, and you get a renewal for another 5 years based on efforts, not on results. So you have to really be working, but you don't have to have proven something in 5 years. Why is this different from anything? Here's the standard model, National Institute of Health. Typical 3 years of funding based on an individual project, and you need preliminary results before you get any funds. And these lead to 2 different classes of things. This one obviously looks more long-term. So you get long-term projects with ambitious goals. I'm going to, for instance, revolutionize the world by developing solar cells over a 10-year period to make cheap, effective solar cells with a completely new material. Here's why we think it'll work, right? Under the NIH model, you got 3 years, you have to already have it. What's the difference? In this case, if you want to develop better solar cells, you say there are currently solar cells that have 17% efficiency. By this clever trick, I can get to 18% efficiency, right? It's an incremental step. So here you develop short-term projects with short-term goals. Here you develop ambitious projects with long-term goals. Which is more effective? It turns out some economists, I finally like economists. I'm sorry, I have to give my bias here. You know, I am a physical scientist. I like people who study things in a careful way, and actually economics has become more and more like that with models and so on. And a couple of economists studied this plan versus this plan. They picked 2 groups of people who up until the point they got funding by one or the other were exactly the same. Then they let them evolve for a few years, and they compared the outcomes of the 2 different groups, and they found out this group, the long-term funding, innovative projects and so on, twice as likely to produce innovative and important results. That's really substantially better, because up to the point where they were funded, they were equal. They were very careful to try and show these 2 groups were equal. So maybe there's a better way to fund people that involves looking to the future in a long-term way, not only short-term. Some other good news. This is an advertisement for why you should go into science. Unemployment rates in general now, well, 6% looks pretty good, but historically 6 to 12% in the US. Unemployment rates in science, typically 2 to 4%. So you can do better in science, and the bachelor's degree salaries are pretty good. This is from 2008, 2009. Chemical engineering, $65,000 a year. Electrical engineering, all three of them who graduated last year, 60. Physics, 53. Mathematics, 49. High school teacher, 37. Psychology, 32. Biology, biology, 32. All of these are pretty nice salaries. And of course the argument was they're so nice that nobody goes on to higher education. Okay, so this is now, this is more or less the last slide I have. So this is essentially advertising from my personal view. I think we do have a problem in the United States. I think we're going to see it, if we don't do anything different, we're going to see some dramatic effects in 10 years. I think we are not going to have enough scientists. And my claim is based on the fact that 70% of all engineering postdocs now are from other countries. If they stay home, which seems to be more and more happening, there is not going to be people to do the science. If we don't have people doing science, we won't have the basis for our prosperity that we've had in the last 40 years. And so I think we really do have a serious problem. I think we've already lost for low-level jobs. Programming, construction of semiconductor circuits, manufacturing, putting pieces together, they're already covered in other countries. I don't think we'll catch up. What can we do? We have to concentrate on what's left. We still, in a sense, own the high-level, most advanced science. At least we're still competitive in that. So I think we need to create more innovative, long-term, ambitious solutions. Some things will fail if you fund them. If you're going to have a lot of new stuff, some things will fail. But you only need one or two things to really turn around an economy. The semiconductor world was based on, essentially, being able to make a transistor. The first transistor made in Bell Labs in, what, 1950, do you know? Do you know? Yeah, some in the 1950s. Dominated our economy for 50 years. You only needed one silicon transistor to have 50 years of prosperity. We need to have a few innovation things work. We need to have incentives to encourage U.S. students to follow the PhD, postdoc, professor research track, because otherwise nobody is going to be doing it in this country, and we'll simply buy stuff from other countries. And to give you a feeling of where we are, if you look at the federal government, entirely 2% of the federal government budget goes for scientific and medical research. This is all the research in the world, meaning in terms of areas. Cancer, Alzheimer's, most of it is medical, by the way. Cancer, Alzheimer's, multiple sclerosis, all of those things that really need some attention in terms of diseases, and probably about less than 1% is for physical sciences, development of the next generation of transistors or whatever, the next generation of an innovative product that will overwhelm the world. It's only 1%, and it's not really enough to encourage people with the financial incentives to go into these fields that is going to keep our prosperity. So that's my personal opinion, and thank you very much.
Time for questions? Maybe one or two.
Yeah.
How much, Luke showed the manufacturing and fabrication industry moving over to Asia. How much of that was driven by economic, environmental, or other government policies between multiple countries? For example, United States minimum wage versus lack thereof in Asia, environmental controls being less, regulations on industries being less.
Yeah. Again, let me start out with my usual disclaimer. I don't know anything about this field, but there's always going to be a but after that. But I have seen arguments that say, certainly initially it was driven by cheaper labor. At this point, the labor isn't that much cheaper. The benefit in labor isn't that much cheaper, and I've seen people argue that it is in fact government regulation or government support of these industries in the various countries that now drives this. And so I think the answer is there's a little bit of both. Certainly that there is a cheaper labor market. Before it used to be much, much cheaper. I think there is also a problem with governmental impact on these various industries. I can't tell you which is the more important, but both seem to be there. Yeah?
With the recent talk about Obama cutting NASA and whatnot, how much of an impact will that have? I mean, is it as big of an impact as people think it is right now? Or?
I don't know the exact number. It worries me too, just from an emotional standpoint. I have to say that Obama has, in fact, I think recognized the larger scale problem here, and has, in fact, increased the amount of money to the National Science Foundation. So there has, in fact, just under the Obama administration, been a slight increase in the percents, in the amount of money going to science. It's not large. Meaning, I would argue if you want to make fundamental changes, change this from 2% to 3%. That would be an enormous boost to science, and we could actually afford to pay people what they're worth. I mean, we have people with PhDs getting $30,000 a year. It's insane, right? They are really drastically underpaid. No wonder nobody goes into these fields. About NASA, I don't really know how much it's being cut, so I'm gonna avoid the question. I'm sorry.
We do have a class, I think, so we better wrap up.
Thank you all.
Adams State College. Great stories begin here.